The evolution of Singapore is one of the most fascinating case studies in modern world history. With little natural resources of its own, with no freshwater resource to write home about, high unemployment rate, an economic crisis at hand, and with the odds against them, no one thought that they could survive. Yet, within one generation, Singapore has achieved staggering economic successes, enjoying one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. Economically, Singapore started life as an independent country on the same level with most African countries, and yet today has left Africa behind. So, where did Singapore get it right and where Africa got it wrong? And what lessons can Africa learn from Singapore's rise? To help us get answers to these questions, my guest for tonight is Mr. Alvin Tan, Singapore's Minister of State for Trade and Industry, and is also in charge of Singapore's economic relations with Africa. It's been a long ride from acceptance to this day, and I'm really grateful for your patience and for your team for making this happen today. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Okasia. We're very happy to be on the program with you.
So moving on to it, it's more of a cliche now when we talk of Singapore's miraculous economic success story. Now, rising from a slum city to a first world power in just a few decades. We all see a fully developed Singapore, which we all admire. But Singapore had very difficult beginnings, I would say. In the words of Singapore's Minister Shanmugam, on the Hard Talk interview with Stephen Saka, he said this, and I quote, he said that we had every disadvantage you can think of as a nation. We did not expect to survive. We're not expected to survive. End of quote. Let me ask you, if you can define one thing that made Singapore's success story possible, what would it be, Alvin?
Well, Akasia, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Senior Minister, is one of our most talented and respected leaders, not just in Singapore, but also globally. And I think many Singaporeans who've watched that Hard Truth segment with Stephen Saka came off feeling even prouder of Minister Shanmugaratnam after the interview. I think the short answer to your question, Akasia, is our people. Because in 1965, 57 years ago, when Singapore left the Federation of Malaysia, many people, actually, in fact, very few, expected us to survive, let alone prosper. And our Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, had also said in 1957 that this idea, it's quite an absurd idea, of an independent Singapore was a political, economic, and geographical absurdity. Akasia, if you came to Singapore, we are about 728.6 kilometers wide. And in 1965, 57 years ago, we have no natural resources. I think even now we have very limited natural resources. We have no hinterland, we have no industry. So we depended on the outside world effectively for our food, our water, our energy, even our security. And the relationship between our people, the relationship between businesses and industry was also not so strong. And our unemployment was close to 9%. So when we separated from Malaysia, our founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, in fact, there was a very famous video of him crying because he thought that he had let our nation down. We were then a very, very small island. So that's one. We were separated from our family, as it were, then. And then toward the south of us, we have a big neighbor, Indonesia. And there was, you may remember, a confrontation where Indonesia had opposed the formation of the Federation of Malaysia, which is comprising of Singapore, Malaya, Sarawak, and Sabah, which is North Borneo. And that's between 1963 to 1966. And so we were cut off our northern hinterland. We were also cut off our southern hinterland. So in addition, it was very difficult because you remember in 1968, the British also famously said we would remove all of our troops east of the Suez by 1971. And that also included troops from Singapore. So in a one fell swoop, we had lost our northern hinterland, our southern hinterland as effectively, and also the support that the British had in terms of their troops. and all the infrastructure that.
So all the odds were against you, Alvin. All the odds were against you. You didn't have water. It was a small island. So I want to know what made it possible for you. What was that one thing that made it possible for Singapore?
Our people, without a shadow of a doubt, because that was the only thing I could say that we had. We had no water, no land, no resources, no industry. So our people, we had good leaders, very thankfully, that first generation of leaders led by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his team that saw us through, made very different decisions,
So everyone looks at Singapore as being a great model for so many things, and especially in the area of people's development and great policy implementation. How significant are these two to Singapore's success and continued growth? And when you look around, what emerging threats do you see as likely to impede or slow down the gains made?
Because it's a very interesting question, because I am a third generation Singaporean. My grandparents, my mother's parents, to be precise, came from southern China, Hainan Island. And my grandfather was a seaman. My grandmother worked as a maid, a domestic helper for the British who were here. My grandfather cleaned toilets in the hotel, in one of our famous hotels called the Raffles Hotel. My father did not go to university, but they managed to eke out a living, grew together with Singapore. And then my generation, my sister and I, my wife, the people of my generation growing up in the 80s, for example, we had a host of opportunities. I was able to get a university degree, go overseas to study, get a graduate degree, and then work in the private sector, now in public sector. So we have, as you mentioned earlier on, Akasia, the transformation from third world to first. I would say the transformation also from the first generation to our third generation was quite dramatic. And it really depended on the policies and as well as the people to make it happen together.
I see one of the cracks in Singapore's economy model is widening the income and wealth inequality. And income inequality is rising, but wealth inequality is probably more glaring, largely because asset value have increased over time. Also, low-income workers are struggling to make ends meet. And while the wealthiest amass multiple properties, the poorest residents are often crammed into tiny housing units. I can say that. Why is that?
There are many perspectives and many angles to look at this. I think the critical part is that as I mentioned, we're only 782 kilometers square of land. And we have now after COVID, about 5.6 million people. We are one of the denser cities. We are a nation state. We don't have vast swaths of land. So we have to make do with what we have. We have done well with regards to moving our population from a GDP of $500-600 per capita to maybe about 55,000 per capita in that 3 decades. In 57 years to be very precise. Of course, when you open your economy, you are going to have people that are doing very, very well and people that are not doing very well. But we have made sure that we have, throughout the development of our country, made sure that we protected and we had policies that ensured that people have a meritocratic ladder to achieve.
Talking about meritocracy, you just mentioned now, Singapore rewards meritocracy, whether in private sphere or in the public sector. Everyone is allowed the opportunity to succeed based on the same test you do. The most talented are selected afterwards. Now, while meritocracy identifies those who are gifted early and rewards them with opportunities, don't you think, Alvin, again, that it stifles the growth of late bloomers or those who excel in non-academic fields?
Yes, I very much agree with that. And I think in the early stages of our development, you have to focus on a large swath of making sure that our people, and I mentioned again, is that story, right? For my parents' generation and my generation to quickly get the key critical skills that are relevant to the world. As the world shifts from a very industrialized base to a very much of a creative base, which is now the era that we are in. And we are in an era where technology, the knowledge economy are all particularly accelerated by COVID, has provided a whole slew of expertise as well as opportunities. So what we have done is first to make sure that meritocracy is one of the foundations of Singapore's success. So you reward those who have done well, through our education system, through our hiring. And I think that makes sure that we try to address issues such as corruption. So you pay your people well in the public service. It's a performance-based culture, meritocracy in public service. You have fiscal prudence.
Alvin, if I go to school and I don't pass, it'll be very difficult for me to climb the academic ladder. Don't you think so?
I had to repeat a year in school, Akasia, and yet I found my paths respectively. My sister also wasn't very good. I think she didn't do very well in primary school, and then she found her own paths. And I think that is the merit of our system, that we are now also creating multiple pathways, whether you are skilled in the arts, whether you are skilled in the math, whether you are skilled in sports. We are providing multiple areas and peaks of excellence, helping our people to gain new skills, and also helping to make sure that there are good companies, foreign companies that come in, create very exciting jobs for our people. I think those are areas in which you create a structure where even people who fail early in their lives, like myself, can find alternative pathways to succeed.
So that means we are, apart from education, we are finding other means, maybe in training or petty trading for others who are not really academically sound.
I think that's spot on, because as technology moves, anything you want to find out, you find out on Google, right? Most of the time. But how do you apply what you learned online and work with other people to create something of value? I think that is very, very critical. And in Singapore, what we've also done is we have, for a couple of years now, pushed through this thing called the Skills Future movement. And Skills Future means to help us to focus our attention on creating skills-based learning for Singaporeans. So, if you could be a hairdresser, how do you make it even, a nicer styles, for example? 2, if you are a coder, how do you use Python, for example, or CCC+? So you have a whole series of a skills framework, and we give our people about $1,000 to $1,500 to go learn new skills. We are now refining this Skills Futures framework so that we're working with industry, we're working with our unions to ensure that our people get skills rather than qualifications. And then work with our potential employers so that they recognize those skills and ensure that they do on-the-job training for our people so that they learn those skills on the job, and then they build and they add value to their companies, to their industries.
I see. You're still watching The Hard Truth. Minister Alvin Tan is the Minister of State for Trade and Industry in Singapore. We'll be right back. To stay. Welcome back to The Hard Truth. Minister Alvin Tan is the Minister of State for Trade and Industry in Singapore. Now, let's talk about leadership. Singapore's success can be, I would say, more or less attributed to the pragmatic leadership of the late Lee Kuan Yew and his successors. Let me find out from you, how pivotal was leadership to Singapore's rise, and how do you react to assertions of authoritarianism?
Yes. Well, Akasia, I think leadership was, as I mentioned earlier on, critical. And I think Singapore was very blessed to have a series of leaders. We usually talk about Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who's our founding Prime Minister. But Mr. Lee Kuan Yew did not lead or guide Singapore alone. He had a group of very able leaders who really cared for Singapore, Mr. S. Rajaratnam, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, among many giants in our history. And we are now in the 4th generation of our leadership, but every succeeding generation, The first generation with Ms. Lee Kuan Yew and his team, the second with Mr. Goh Chok Tong and his team, the third generation with our current Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, have all had to find their way to build the trust with new generations of Singaporeans. So if you ask my grandparents' generation or my parents' generation, they grew up effectively with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his team. The new generation, every succeeding leadership will have to build that trust. And if you look at the experience that we've had over the last 2 years with COVID-19, I think this new generation of leaders, the fourth generation of leaders, have now built that trust with our people. And that's why I would think that we have gotten past COVID-19 with one of the lowest rates of fatalities in the world, and with many of our health systems running well and intact. So I think succeeding generations of Singaporean leaders have had to find their trust in the people and vice versa, and to stir them through hard times. We talked earlier on about how we had moved from third generation, or rather third world to a first world. And if we did not have the trust by our people to continually give us the mandate to steward them and to guide them and to govern them, then you wouldn't have the Singapore that you see today. We have competitive elections. I mean, I competed in my first maiden election in July 2020. I had to go down to the ground, campaign, make the case to Singaporeans, and earn the mandate of Singaporeans to govern in this term of government.
You didn't buy a vote from your delegates?
In Singapore, that does not happen. In Singapore, you go down to the ground. Tonight, I could say, after I speak with you, in about an hour after I speak with you, I'm going down to a block of public housing flats to meet with my constituents, to learn about what is most important to them, to see whether their drains are being cleared, to see whether there's mosquitoes, to see whether they're okay with COVID. 1 hour later, I'm taking off my suit, I'm going down. And when we win, if we win the elections, every round, the campaign, so-called the campaign, starts the very next day. And that is the discipline that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew have installed in the People's Action Party and our government for over 7 years. What I'm trying to say is we don't think about the short-term elections. I'm saying that every time when we win an election, if we win an election, the very next day we are down to governing. The very next day we are down to serve our people, and the people will see us in their place, in their homes, and if they trust us, they will give us a new mandate. Yeah.
Now let's go on to this. Your country, Singapore, has been able to raise its GDP per capita within one generation from about $400 to $59,798 by 2020. Quite phenomenal, I would say. But to achieve this, there are certain hard truths we cannot run from. And then a sacrifice had to be made somewhere else, and some restrictions on fundamental civil rights. Can I say that? Were there restrictions on fundamental human rights in trying to get to the point where you are now?
I think it's the perception that you take to this question, and I think it's a very important question. And I think there are different modes of freedom that all of us value. For example, I have a young daughter. You have 2 young daughters.
Right.
At 2 p.m. in the evening, when they become teenagers, they are safe in the streets of Singapore. They have the freedom to walk the streets of Singapore safe. Even last night, when we start to open up our nightlife establishment after 2 years of COVID restrictions, we were on the ground. We saw many young ladies enjoy the nightlife, and they are confident because they can walk the streets of Singapore, the clubs, safe, knowing that we have all of that in place. People are safe to walk the streets safely. People are safe to pursue their religion and their race. So one of the core cornerstones in Singapore is the freedom to practice your faith. Last night, I was in one of my mosques, a Chinese Christian in a Malay Muslim mosque with other Hindus together. So you are free to practice your faith. So there's freedom of expression, there's freedom of security, there's freedom of expressing.
Right, but according to the 2020 Freedom in the World report by Freedom House, and I quote, it said the Singaporean government uses racial or religious tensions and the threat of terrorism to justify restrictions on freedom of speech. Media outlets, bloggers, and media figures have been subjected to harsh civil criminal penalties for speech deemed to be seditious, defamatory, or injurious to religious sensitivities. What would you say to this?
I would invite them to come to Singapore and tell me, look me in the eye, come to my mosque, come to my temples, come to my churches, and see whether we are building the racial and religious integration, where many different countries have fractured within ethnic and racial lines, or you see a Singapore where a Chinese Christian can go to the mosque, share a meal with our Muslim friends. So if you came to Singapore and at every single religious and racial festival that you can, and you come to the ground with me, you will see a very, very different Singapore from the ones that other people who may not know Singapore have experienced.
How does your country balance the political rights and economic rights? How do you balance that?
Well, I think the first things first is you have to make sure that your people have jobs and have the freedom to be able to go out at night free from persecution, free from security issues. That's one. Make sure that your young have good jobs, and make sure that, because we are one of the most racially and ethnically diverse nations in the world, Acacia, of many different faiths. Next week, I'm going to be in an event with our Sikh community, for example. And I think what you want to do is to make sure that, first of all, you make sure you have the economic opportunities for all, so that every single race, every single people of faith will have the ability to, through their own talents, have opportunities to pursue their dreams, their aspirations, and to get the jobs which they want to. That is the absolute baseline. At the same time, you need to make sure that on the social side and the social integration front, we have certain architectures. We have a presidential council on minority rights to ensure that Parliament and to ensure that legislators do not enact laws that will favor one race over the other. So it's ensconced in our constitution, and it's also ensconced in who we are as Singaporeans.
Now, your country again started with a lot of disadvantages, but managed to turn things around. However, many African countries started with a lot of advantages, but have still not realized their full potential in terms of development. Alvin, where do you think the disconnect is? Why is that?
Actually, I can't speak for the African countries, but Africa is a good and long-standing friend of Singapore. I can speak about Singapore. And what I have experienced is that over the three generations of family as a Singaporean born, bred here, is that we have somehow turned a lot of our disadvantages into advantages. Because of the fact that we don't have our own land, the fact we don't have resources, we have to be creative, be innovative. You know, if you don't have land, you build upwards. If you don't have water, you try to change even your wastewater into drinking water and potable water, which is what we've done. If you don't have sun, you do something about it. So, for example, we have placed as many solar panels on even our reservoirs, to capture the sun for renewable energy. So when you don't have these resources, you have to then are forced to think creatively, because you don't have the luxury of oil, you don't have the luxury of land, you don't even have the luxury of 20, 30, 40, 100 million people. So with this, you have to think creatively. You have to use with what little resources you have, and then try, build, and then hopefully we get somewhere with our people.
So what aren't we doing right in Africa? What are some African countries not doing right? Because they have resources, they have natural resources. Why is that disconnect?
Well, I wish Singapore would have natural resources. Unfortunately, we cannot move our little island of 728.6 kilometers square to somewhere else. We are just smack in the middle of actually on the equator, Akasia. And of course, we look askance at people with or countries with bigger land.
Do you think African countries should do better because they have all the resources and they have every advantage on their side?
I think many countries with resources would ideally, in the ideal state, do better, much better than Singapore. I think if Singapore had these advantages, I'm not sure, because ultimately, Akosia, you mentioned one key point, and I think both of us agree, which is people and leadership. And I think if Singapore, even if we had a lot of resources and we had not so good leadership, or even if we did not have the benefit of having Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and Mr. S. Rajaratnam and Dr. Goh Keng Swee in the early days, I don't think Singapore would have tried or at least prospered in the manner that we have thus far. So leadership is important, but also the trust that our people, our generations of people had in our leaders had enabled us to journey alongside for 3 generations.
It's common rhetoric to hear people talk about, replicating Singapore's success story in Africa. Isn't that simple? It sounds quite nice. Is it simple to replicate a Singapore in any part of Africa?
Well, I think every country is very different. And if you look at the discussions that myself and as well as many of our leaders have had with many of our friends overseas, they always ask this question. I remember there was a very famous question posed to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew when he was alive, to ask the same questions if Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was asked to govern India. And Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, if you can check out the video, I think he had a very interesting conversation about it. He says, there's really a hypothetical. And he said it's very difficult for example, to govern a place as big as India, because you have, 50 over different languages and a huge swath of land. So it's very difficult for us to see whether or even contemplate governing a different country or have ideas to govern a different country. It's difficult enough to govern a small country and make it stand out in the world. Even as we speak, our finance minister is in the G20 meeting in Washington, D.C. We are nowhere near the size of any of our G20 neighbors, Akasia. But the fact that the G20 has seen fit year after year after year to invite Singapore means that we have a little bit to offer to the world of governance, in the world of finance, in the world of economics, trade, and even the social side. So I think we try to punch above our weight. If there's another Singapore there, I don't think there will be another Singapore, just as there won't be another Ghana. We have our own special challenges and opportunities too.
I see. But again, what lessons can African countries glean from Singapore's success and failures? And how can they emulate those successes to avoid the mistakes you made?
Over time, of course, in the course of our governance, made plenty of things that we can do better. But there are many things that I think we've also learned how to build upon. I give you, for example, even during the COVID pandemic, there were times where maybe we have acted too fast, maybe we have acted too slow. But ultimately, you look back and you see whether you have achieved the outcomes that you want to achieve. With regards to Africa and African countries, I think the first thing I would like to say is that, Singapore is really a long-standing friend, of Africa. Going back to history, in 1964, even before 1965, which is the date of our independence, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew embarked on a 35-day tour of 17 African cities. And then he already built strong friendship with many of Africa's pioneering leaders, from Egypt to Tanzania to Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah. And even now today, Singapore still trades with almost every country in Africa. And what do we trade? We trade fruits, electronics, services such as transport and logistics. And this trade with the African continent has continued to grow despite the COVID-19 pandemic. So while we cannot talk about, what lessons here and there, I think what we can do is exchange ideas of what we have done better, what we've not done better, but also in terms of trade and economics. I think that's quite useful for us.
You're still watching The Hard Truth. Minister Alvin Tan is the Minister of State for Trade and Industry in Singapore. We'll be right back. To stay. Minister of State of Trade and Industry, Singapore, Mr. Alvin Tan, is my guest tonight on The Hard Truth. Alvin, do you see Lee Kuan Yew in the current crop of African leaders? Do you think you see any of our leaders in a position as Lee Kuan Yew?
Actually, I mentioned earlier on that I think Singapore has been quite blessed to have Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, but it's not just about him alone. It's about the whole team. Mr. S. Rajaratnam, Dr. So we don't focus on personalities, and in fact, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew firstly told us, if you really want to remember me, look at Singapore. Just look at Singapore. You don't need to have any statues, anything to commemorate me.
Alvin, what about Paul Kagame, president of Rwanda? Some believe that he's turning Rwanda into Singapore of Africa. What do you think? Is he turning Rwanda into Singapore of Africa?
I haven't met Paul Kagame. I've been to Kigali and Rwanda, and I know that Rwanda's had a challenging past. And I've had very good friends there who tell me about the incredible work that they have done to reconcile. I visited together with my wife as we visited, I think, in about 2013 or something. And it really, I still remember, it really reminded me of a lot of the work that we have to do here in Singapore to make sure that our people are united. Because my friend who was there experienced that episode, and she said, never again. And so it got me thinking, in Singapore, we must make sure. Because, Akosia, we also had racial riots, in our history that were very painful. If you ask our grandparents and their generation, they've also experienced that. And we never again want to do that. We are under no illusion that these things could happen in a snap, especially within the platforms now in social media and internet. So we are very, very careful in making sure that we always build that interracial and religious harmony that we hold very dearly to our hearts right now. So yeah, I remember that trip to Africa, and I remember what my friends have told me from Rwanda particularly, and I hold it really deep in my heart.
Right. So what do you think now? Is their leader Paul Kagame turning Rwanda into a Singapore of Africa?
I think many countries have really been very flattering of Singapore and says, I want to be the Singapore of Europe or Latin America or Africa. And we are, of course, very, very thankful and very flattered by those comparisons. But I think what's quite critical is for us to make sure that we are connected to these different continents. So connected to Africa. I just made a trip to South America, to Colombia, and there are also people that says, "Oh no, we look up to Singapore." And I say, "Well, in fact, we have to learn from you as well." And Singapore has always had that mentality, Akosia. We never, if you think about the innovations, we are always looking at other countries. We travel very much often to see what countries have done that we can learn from and maybe even improve and tweak to our specific context.
Whilst we're talking about, what Africa can learn from Singapore, let me find out from you, is there anything that Singapore can also learn from Africa? Is there something you're learning from us?
What I really wanted to share is that Africa, for example, has an incredible diversity. I visited, I really want to visit Ghana. And I think now that our countries are starting to open up borders, I wanted to follow in the footsteps of Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam and Dr. Tan Wu Ming. I have visited Rwanda, as I mentioned earlier on, Tanzania, as well as Nairobi, Kenya. I haven't gone to Ghana. But I always enjoy a few things.
You should come to Ghana.
And I'll take you up on that offer. But I always thought that the African spirit of being welcoming, of being open, being very hospitable is something which, even Singapore we can learn from. that spirit, and also the spirit of overcoming against many odds. Despite a lot of different challenges, I think that's something that we can also learn from. But what's critical right now is that, as I mentioned earlier on, we trade with almost every country in Africa, and we want to do more in terms of trade. We want to do more in terms of participating in Africa's growth and development. When I was in the private sector, I looked askance at Africa and looked at the way that you do mobile payments, for example, the way that you adopt bank the unbanked. And I thought that was a huge opportunity that you have leapfrogged many times ATMs, for example, to go into digital banking. So the ability of Africans to adopt technology very quickly, a very young, vibrant, dynamic population, whereas on Singapore's side, we have a demographic challenge because we are going to be one of the fastest aging populations in the world over the next 2 to 3 decades. So we look to Africa to see how you turn your demographic dividend into something which we can learn from. Your youth, your ability, your openness to people. I think that's critical for us to learn.
Singapore's absolute role in Africa remains small, as compared to those of Western and of the Chinese interest. What is Singapore's strategy when it comes to trade relations with Africa? What will you prioritize?
Well, I mentioned earlier on that we want to actively participate in Africa's growth and development, and we see many different opportunities. In fact, our companies have ventured into Africa and gained a certain degree of traction on the African continent as you open up to digitalization and to regional integration and also to global trade. In fact, more than 60 of our companies are present in Africa, and they're operating in about 40 countries across a whole variety of industries. And on our part, Singapore can help Africa too, because even though we are a small nation state, island state, we are and can be, as we are with many different regions around the world, a gateway for ASEAN-African trade. And so we can support African companies looking to set up regional bases here in ASEAN so that you can be a launchpad. Singapore can be a launchpad to the Southeast Asian market of $660 billion. And even just Southeast Asia alone, Akasia, has a combined GDP of over $3 trillion just in 2020 alone. And Singapore is really at a very, our strategic location. We are strategically located in the main nexus of key trade flows between East Asia and Africa. We are a short flight. If you came to, please come to Singapore as you have invited me to Ghana. But we are just short from Indonesia to Malaysia to Thailand to Philippines and to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. There are already more than 7,000 multinational companies that have set up operations in Singapore, half of them using Singapore as their regional headquarters. I note that Ghana will be opening or developing your own COVID-19 vaccines by 2024, I read. Yesterday we did a groundbreaking on Sanofi, which is developing vaccines also in Singapore. So there are many different areas in which we can collaborate on, and I hope to see more of such partnerships between Africa and Singapore on migration, vaccines, in sustainability, amongst others.
Alvin, time is fast spent, but we have a few more issues that we need to touch on. Let's talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Such an ambitious trade path will actually form the world's largest free trade area for connecting almost 1.3 billion people across 54 African countries. What are your thoughts on this, and what would it mean for Singapore in terms of trade and investment?
Well, the AFCFTA is really a praiseworthy initiative to create a single market in Africa, and you can then use that to facilitate the movement of goods and services across the whole African continent. So we do see opportunities for our companies to leverage the FTA to expand Singapore companies' presence in Africa. And a part of it is the eventual elimination of 90% of tariff lines and also the liberalization of various sectors. So Singapore and global companies can enjoy reduced input costs and gain access to a wider pan-African market with a single manufacturing base. So I think that's very critical because it allows Africa, Singapore, and even the ASEAN states that I mentioned earlier on to reap these benefits and to foster greater interconnectedness between Africa, ASEAN, and in fact, to East Asia. So we see this as a great opportunity. We hope and we want to participate in this and want to make sure that it is as successful as it can be. And we stand ready to be a launch pad for the African continent to come over to this part of the world.
Alvin, how would you describe Ghana's economy? What is the government doing right? What is it doing wrong? And what can it do better?
Well, I would say that I would start with the base that Singapore and Ghana, both of us right now, I think we have very good rapport. So, and our countries do also have that good rapport.
Right.
We share warm family relations. We have sent our senior ministers across, get to know your people, your leaders. And Ghana has consistently ranked as one of Singapore's top 10 trade and investment partners in sub-Saharan Africa. So we do see Ghana as a really important and a good partner in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we also want to deepen those linkages, the people-to-people linkages, the political linkages, and the economic linkages. I mentioned earlier on that we have a lot of high-level exchanges in recent years. Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam visited Ghana in 2019. He met with many officials, including President Nana Akufo-Addo as well. And we've also signed the Avoidance of Double Taxation Agreement, or DTA, which just entered into force since 2020. We have an agency called Enterprise Singapore, which opened in 2013 an overseas center in Accra to provide support for Singapore companies that are wishing to expand in West Africa. So we have many different touch points for Singaporean companies to go to Africa, and we similarly welcome Ghanaian companies to come to Singapore to expand in Singapore and also to ASEAN and the region.
I can sense that you are very invested into the country, so you must know about our politics there. How would you describe our president? Do you think he's doing well? How is Nana Akufo-Addo and his government faring? Do you think the government is doing well?
From what I understand, I think Ghana has done really well in terms of helping to steer your country through the pandemic. And for us, for Singapore, I think that's really good for us because we have very, very good businesses in Singapore, in Ghana, and also our FMCG sector. We have, I'm sure you know about these two companies. You know, I would say you have Olam, Wilmar, well-known names in Ghana. They are among the largest agribusiness companies globally and have extensive presence in other parts of Africa too. So, for example, Olam is a leading cashew exporter and one of the largest importers of rice in Ghana. Wilmar, largest producer and marketer for edible oils and rice in Ghana. These companies would not be in Ghana if you did not have a stable environment and a conducive environment to do business. So we do see that this administration is fostering a conducive business environment for us to continue to foster this engagement and investments into Ghana as well.
Thank you so much, Alvin Tan, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Mr. Tan is Singapore's Minister of State for Trade and Industry. I would also like to say a huge thank you to Serena Chen, Xiao Yang, Mildred Fang, Uma Muniandi, Melvin Lin, Kenneth, and all the coordinating team from Singapore's Trade Ministry who made this interview possible. I hope I got your names right. Thank you. You've been watching The Hard Truth. My name is Nana Akosia Konidwa Santos Samuels. We'll see you soon. Good night.